Bonjour à toutes et à tous et merci de l'intérêt que vous avez porté à ce webinaire, Faire face à la violence dans les territoires contestés, pour lequel nous sommes ravis de nous associer avec la Croix Rouge canadienne pour promouvoir notre cours d'été en droit international humanitaire. Welcome and thank you for your interest in this webinar, Navigating Violence in Contested Territories, for which we are delighted to be partnering with the Canadian Red Cross to promote our joint summer school in international humanitarian law. I'm Penelope Simons. I'm a professor at the Common Law faculty at the University of Ottawa and the new director of the Human Rights Research and Education Centre. And we are speaking today from unceded Algonquin territory. Before we start, I just wanted to mention our International Humanitarian Law Summer School, which runs from May 31st to June 5th, and registration for it opens on March the 1st. It's the only bilingual international humanitarian law summer school in the world. We have two cohorts of approximately 30 participants at the same time, a vibrant mix of students and professionals. And we have very experienced lecturers, and then one day of simulation that strikes a balance between understanding the legal framework around armed conflicts and translating it into practice. I'll now pass the microphone to Fanny Desjardins-Dion, the legal advisor of international humanitarian law at the Canadian Red Cross. Fanny?
Thanks, Penelope. Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the University of Ottawa and the Human Rights and Research and Education Centre for setting this up. I'm really excited to participate to that event. So just first and foremost, as you might have seen already, the event will be recorded. So just wanted to let you know about that. So welcome to this webinar. The way it's going to work we'll have a 25-minute discussion with our panelists, and then it will be followed by a Q&A period. So you see in the Zoom application, you have the Q&A function, so you can type your questions there, and we will try to answer to all of them if we have time. Hopefully we do. But yeah, please don't hesitate to write your questions. We'll be really happy to get to them after that discussion. Si vous avez des questions en français, vous êtes les bienvenus aussi à les poser. If you have questions in French, I will translate them. So je vais les traduire en anglais pour notre panéliste, mais pas de souci pour ça. So we will get started now. So welcome to this webinar called Navigating Violence in Contested Territories. So right now, there are more than 130 armed conflicts in 40 countries going on in the world. So we talk a lot about Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but there are several other ones. The number has more than doubled since 2009. And in the past decades, we've seen that civilians were the ones who have been increasingly affected by armed conflict. Over 200 million people live in what we can call contested territories, which can be described as places where the authority of the state is challenged outright and armed groups exercise full or fluid control. So on some, but not all cases where IHL applies. So in addition to navigating IHL, so international humanitarian law, there's also international human rights law and domestic law. Civilians living in these territories must navigate different and competing rules imposed by different actors, and often with little to no access to essential services. So in response to that situation we've been seeing, in November 2025, the International Committee of the Red Cross published its report, which is called Navigating Violence, Learning from Civilian Experiences and Strengthening Humanitarian Action in Contested Territories, which focuses on how people cope and adapt in places with shifting territorial control and unpredictable violence. So that's the report we are here to talk about. And we are very lucky to have with us Dr. Matthew Bembers-Ruud, the International Committee of the Red Cross advisor on armed groups. He is based at ICRC headquarters in Geneva, where he supports the organization's humanitarian engagement with armed groups. Prior to joining the ICRC, he worked on conflict and armed groups for various governments and multilateral bodies, conducted field research across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Matthew is a specialist in transnational jihadist armed groups and examines how these groups form, operate, and adapt within conflict environments. His research has appeared in Terrorism and Political Violence, Small War and Insurgencies, the CTC Sentinel, and other peer-reviewed journals. He has provided expert testimony to government and multilateral bodies on armed group dynamics. Matthew obtained a PhD in political science and international relations from the Graduate Institute in Geneva and holds fellowships at the Center on Conflict, Development, and Peace Building at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. Dr. Bembers-Rud carried out the report we are discussing today jointly with his colleague Arjun Clare, who couldn't make it today. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Matthew. We'll start with a few questions we have prepared for you so you can talk more about the report, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. So in the introduction, I gave a small description of contested territories, but I wanted to know, how does this translate on the ground, especially for civilians, and what makes them different from other conflict settings?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you very much, Fanny, and to the Canadian Red Cross and University of Ottawa for the invitation to speak today. The report was published in November, and it's really great to be able to have these type of events and to answer people's questions about the report. As Fanny mentioned in the introduction, there's more than 200 million persons living in contested territories around the world at the moment, and that is only increasing. It's increased by 30 million over the past few years. So this is a topic that is very timely and unfortunately is only increasing in need. So contested territories, some of the ways that they differ for civilians, there's a couple of different ways. But first, just to set up the legal framework a little bit, because contested territories is not a legal term. It's purely a descriptive term, which we have defined as areas where armed groups challenge the state authorities through violence and other means, very distinct from the legal definition of occupied territory under international humanitarian laws. But we chose this term because we feel that there's something that sets contested territories apart. There are kind of four dynamics that we identified that set these territories apart. The first one, which you mentioned in your introduction, is the competing rules that civilians face when they're living in areas that are contested by one or multiple armed groups and the state as well. If you're a civilian living in this area, you often have to abide by the rules set by the state by one armed group, but that armed group might leave, and then you have to apply rules by one other. One person who we interviewed in Cameroon said that if I defy one side, I'll be killed, and if I defy the other, I'll be arrested. So often people living within these areas have to kind of navigate these competing set of rules, orders, demands that they have to live with that can shift constantly. That sets them apart from areas under more stable either armed group control or state control. The other thing is the constant shifts in control. We can see that in many of the areas of contested control, the borders of armed group control and state control are very fluid, changing rapidly. And the implication for this is that stable institutions that all civilians around the world rely on are very difficult to take root in these areas. Often the state cannot get access to provide the services it was providing before. Often an armed group doesn't have capacity or willingness to engage in to establish institutions that civilians need. So therefore, this constant shifts in control have a severe implications on institutionalization in these areas. The third aspect of contested territories is the weaponization of identity. So we know that both armed groups and often states can exploit ethnic and religious grievances in conflict. So therefore, a person's clan nature, tribal nature, their racial identity, their sexual identity, all of these things can become identities that are very easily weaponized by armed group. As someone from Cameroon, there's a pastoral conflict going on there between the pastoralists and another community there. And they said to us, we're targeted as groups and not as individuals. So therefore, if you just go into the wrong area with the wrong type of identity, then again, you can face severe consequences. And the fourth one is in contested territories that really sets this area apart is the large degree of service disruption and the weaponization of services as well. So we see that in some areas, armed groups deliberately shut down services and institutions as part of their conflict campaign, shutting down schools, attacking hospitals, removing civilian documentation, and removing the basic institutions that people have to kind of live and survive on. And these effects often outlast the conflict. If you don't have civil documentation, if you don't have a birth certificate, if you don't have a marriage certificate, and even when the armed group leaves and potentially state control has been resumed, the entire consequences for the rest of your life moving forward are still there if you do not have a documentation. So we do see that in these areas particularly, there is large weaponization of these services. And I spoke about these four dynamics separately, but it's important that they are all interact with each other and they reinforce each other. That's what makes them kind of distinct from these other settings. The shifting control, the contradictory demands, the weaponized identity, the service disruption, all of these happen at the same time, reinforcing each other. So even when a potential period of contestation has gone, we can still see the effects after the intensity of the violence has lessened and the contestation has stopped. Civilians living in these areas still bear the effects of that.
Thank you so much. I think from an IHL perspective, which is the law of war, I think it's really important to point out a situation which we don't have it's not a legal definition, but right now it is the reality. And we have to really make sure we tailor some legal frameworks to the actual factual situations that are happening. So just to confirm and to maybe from a legal perspective, look at that. So it doesn't mean that IHL will apply to every situation in contested territories, because it would mean that for IHL to apply, we are in an armed conflict. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, that's correct. So in the areas of contested territories, it's not the status of the kind of persons or the territory it's not the status of the territory that defines the legal protections, but actually the status of the armed conflict. So probably explaining something that's very, very well known to most of the people in the audience, but if an armed group meets the definition of being legally qualified as a non-state armed group and therefore as a party to a non-international armed conflict, because it has is sufficiently organized and reaches a sufficient threshold of violence, then the non-state armed group has to abide by its international humanitarian law obligations. Similarly, the state, if it's engaged in a non-international armed conflict with a non-state armed group, has to also maintain its international humanitarian law obligations to civilians residing across the whole of the state, not just those in contested areas and not just those in state-like areas. So if a conflict has been classified as a non-international armed conflict, then civilians in those areas benefit from international humanitarian law protections. But also, it's important to note that in cases where the conflict hasn't been classified as non-international armed conflict, there are situations in which international human rights law can still apply as well. These cases clarified that point as well on the territorial control of armed groups. So international human rights law can apply. It's a little bit of a grey area compared to everything else, but that's the case. In reality, we have more than 130 armed groups who are qualified as being non-state armed groups around the world. So the vast bulk of contested territories at the moment are in areas where we have an armed group that meets the threshold of being a non-state armed group. But it's true that there are some areas where that threshold has not been met. So some civilians there do not benefit from the protection of international humanitarian law.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so bottom line, we want the civilians to be protected, whatever the legal framework is. But
precisely, yeah, and that's also the viewpoint of the ICRC as well. Yes.
Thank you. So let's circle back to the report, because so basically you explore three main situations from three different countries, so Cameroon, Iraq, and the Philippines. So is there a particular choice why these three countries were chosen? And maybe if you can, are there key points that emerge from all three, either similarities or differences?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, very good question. So yes, we chose the Cameroon, so specifically Anglophone Cameroon. We wanted to choose case studies on something that we call the arc of contestation. So ranging from very high, intense, active conflict now to post-conflict settings, and then also to those that have transitioned from post-conflict to kind of post-peace agreement context. So that was really kind of the main threshold that we wanted, as well as having sufficient geographical diversity as well. We really wanted those in different conflict settings. So Cameroon at the moment is a very active hostilities. There are multiple armed groups contesting in the area, very disruptive form of governance, and lots of people, lots of persons being internally displaced within Cameroon as well. And then in Iraq, it's been 8 years since the last area of Islamic State held territory was taken. So it's a post-conflict setting, but many of the civilians living in the areas previously controlled by the Islamic State are still kind of suffering from the consequences of that contestation today. And then the Philippines is in a post-peace agreement in where we were in Mindanao, but we still see that there are kind of persistent localized violence. Elections at the time of visiting elections were still pending. So to see the implications of this contestation much further along the arc of contestation and elsewhere. So that's that's kind of the main criteria we had, as well as kind of basic criteria around safety for us and for our ICRC teams in the field as well, who we conducted it with. But there were a couple of patterns that we could see across all of these specific case studies looked at, and then also across different contexts as well, which we didn't visit, but we have visited previously in our work for ICRC or in other roles. So one is that often there's grievance as an origin. All three conflicts that we visited were preceded by widespread protests amongst the civilian community, and definitely feelings of alienation from parts of the community as well. And that's a core often amongst many contested territories. We saw one aspect that we saw is the governance spectrum. So the way that armed groups choose to govern the territories that they control, choose to or choose not to govern, has a huge implication on the civilian experiences there. There's some armed groups that try to model state-like institutions very quickly on early, institute some type of participatory process in their governance and have that kind of approach. There's others that are much more disruptive, that choose to not govern, that focus very much on violence and coercive means and are not interested or not capable of providing state-like institutions, and for example, education and healthcare, etc. So there's a huge amount of variation in the type of control that armed groups have, and the implications on this on civilians is very severe. Also, one thing we noticed is that we talked about the weaponization of identity previously, but in all three contexts, identity worked very much as a double-edged sword, potentially being both a source of kind of protection in the community, but also being very much a source of vulnerability as well. And that can also shift across time and the conflict as well. So some persons for whom their identity was in the early stages of a conflict a source of protection because of one armed group that's in the area, very quickly became their largest source of vulnerability, and they had to alter their life because of that. And then I would also say two kind of final things is that consequences of contestation far outlive the actual kind of intensity of violence. So, for example, in Cameroon, some areas are relatively quiet in terms of intensity of violence, but you visit there and the consequences are still as much as present as persons who are in caught in conflict right now. The danger levels might be different, but the consequences are still there. And we saw even in Iraq and the Philippines, 8 years on from conflict, 15 years on from conflict in some places, that the consequences remain. And finally is that we really wanted this report to be focused on people's experiences rather than kind of an institutional response, very much focused on people's experiences. And one thing is people's agency. across all three conflicts. People in all three areas were able to develop very sophisticated self-protection strategies. So in some cases, people did not have agency, but in very many areas we saw it, and we saw kind of unique interlocutors coming up to the fore to be able to take on roles that they hadn't before, and to develop ways of strategy and survival that is quite remarkable in the situations that often people were facing. So we saw, for example, in the Philippines, these kind of interreligious early warning systems being developed across villages to warn of conflicts coming. In Cameroon, we saw multiple examples of people being able to negotiating, forming their own councils to engage with both the state and the armed groups. In one case, we met some women's peace networks who walked 40 kilometers across multiple checkpoints to negotiate the release of their family from military camps, from military detention. So we can see across all contexts, the role that people agency have and the ability to develop these self-protection mechanisms.
Thanks. That's very interesting. I think it's really important to center the people affected by either the armed conflict, but also the consequences, which can be way more long-term after a conflict takes place. So I think in international law, it's easy to forget that the civilians, the population, the civil society. So I think that's a really interesting perspective to center the narrative around them. I think it's interesting as well to see that there are quite a lot of similarities, even if we see that the three countries that were chosen are not close to one another. So seeing how the patterns can be similar from a country to another, even if it's quite geographically far. So you also mentioned the ICRC's team and working in those settings and the safety. So in the report, it is mentioned the competing nature of armed actors, coercive authorities, and rules. So can you tell us how the complexity of those contested territories can affect the work of the ICRC, your work, as well as the other humanitarian actors when there are other on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll primarily speak from an ICRC perspective, but many of the same things that we face. We also interviewed other humanitarian practitioners as well. So many of the challenges that we face are also faced by other humanitarian practitioners. So alongside this report, each year we kind of do internally a kind of mapping of our relationship with armed groups to see where we can do better and where our challenges lie. So just to give a broad context, it's humanitarian engagement with armed groups is very difficult anyway, but particularly in contested areas, it's actually probably easier to engage with armed groups in areas where they have more stable control, because it's much easier to build, much easier to operate there, to build relationships and trust that is necessary for humanitarian access. But so in 2025, there were 383 armed groups of humanitarian concern to the ICRC. And with half of those, it was difficult for us to engage with them, both due to insecurity. So it was difficult for our staff to kind of enter. And then also it was difficult to engage with half of armed groups because of restrictions imposed by the state. Made it difficult for us to engage. They wouldn't let us go, or they imposed modalities that are not in line with ICRC's neutrality and operational model. So these are kind of the basic context around it. And in only 50% of contested areas, the ICRC is able to kind of provide some type of economic security, kind of health and water assistance, so assistance activities. Why it is particularly complex in contested territories? The first one is just kind of a multiplied negotiation that we have to have. If you have dozens of actors operating in an area, it means you have to have dozens of negotiations. You have very fluid command structures, so you have to make sure you're speaking to the right person in the hierarchy to be able to kind of give permission. And you can have very local, hyper-local variation, which makes it exceptionally difficult if you're trying to provide, if you're trying to transport some assistance to a hospital or some economic security, some seeds or kind of like even basic assistance in a truck. It makes it very difficult. Secondly, is the perception of that risk of being perceived as being aligned to one armed group or another. The ICRC, we're a neutral organization, and neutrality is central to being able to operate in these contested territories. So having areas which are contested and where you have to speak to armed groups or to the state, it can create tensions in the community or amongst the state, and if they view that you're not being neutral on that one side. So just the proliferation of actors increases that risk. Then also we have in contested territories, there's often the impact of counterterrorism legislation as well, both domestic and international. So often at the domestic level, some states choose to designate armed groups as terrorists, which then has an effect of potentially being able to freeze the amount of assistance that we are able to provide. Or even if it doesn't have any kind of tangible material implications, it can still have a freezing risk just because of the perceived consequences of engaging with an armed group in that area. So it just heightens negotiations kind of with the state, and also with on the ground. It makes it much more difficult. And also kind of the contested territories, they're often very operationally complex to operate in. So we also, as a humanitarian organization and other humanitarian organizations, can often choose to go to areas where it's less complex to operate in. So potentially going to the sidelines where there's not as many actors, but maybe potentially where the new needs aren't as acute. So it's very important to be able to kind of center the needs of the people rather than the potential difficulties in reaching that area. There were some very good examples that we saw from the ICRC work where it was, and in other humanitarian organizations' work as well, to get around this is where they kind of have a protection-oriented approach. So prioritizing areas by violence intensity and where the needs are greatest rather than where humanitarian access is easier. And then also kind of focusing prior protection dialogue or engagement on protection topics along with assistance. Sometimes there's a easier potentially to kind of go with assistance-led interventions first, because it's generally a little bit easier, but it's important to have protection there from the very beginning as well, because it can often be mutually reinforcing. And we saw some really great examples of that type of confidential protection-based dialogue and engagement having really tangible results for the civilians living in those communities as well. But in effect, it just makes everything far more complicated, coupled with CT legislation, which can make it even more complicated and increase the risks for everyone, including the civilian communities.
So much. I think the center was a great example of the operational challenges of as well, the ICRC being a neutral organization and wanting to work with everyone. So what it can have as an impact too. If you want to work with everyone, it has to be clear who you want to talk with, who you are or you're not associated with. So I think it is a great example of how challenging it can become when there are several actors. And you talked about it already a bit, but I'd like to come back to the counterterrorism and sanctions, because that happens a lot. So we have a lot of groups when they are not part of the government who are identified as either a terrorist group or just have sanctions towards them. So how does this impact your work, the community, and the humanitarian space?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to, particularly for this audience as well, distinguish between international counterterrorism listing and domestic one. So again, in this kind of mapping of armed groups, we look at the role of CT legislation. And in general, we find that international counterterrorism legislation doesn't have a huge impact on our work particularly, but it's more kind of a domestic listing. So when an armed group is listed as a terrorist group in the state in which it operates, it can have the biggest implication for us. For us as a humanitarian organization, from that perspective, it's because it's potentially criminalizes the engagement of the persons doing engagement. At the ICRC, we have both international staff and we also have resident staff as well. And it can, particularly for our resident staff, can increase the chances of greater backlash from the state if they're perceived as being engaged with perceived as engaging with terrorist groups. For humanitarian options as well, there's a lot of donor risk aversion potentially as well. which is something we continuously work on as well. ICRC, we don't have that problem so much, but for other organizations, there might be donors do not want to kind of fund aid which is going into areas areas controlled or contested by groups prescribed as being terrorist groups. So that's on the humanitarian operations. Then on the communities, it's an interesting one. Again, it's mostly related to domestic listing, potentially having banking restrictions, collapsed telecommunications, kind of trade blockages, pushing people who might be affiliated with perceived to be affiliated with a terrorist group being pushed into kind of a formal or illicit economy. Sanctions target groups, but often the burden falls on civilians, especially when someone coming from an area where a designated terrorist group operates will just often be perceived by the state as being part of a terrorist group, even though they're just civilians operating in that area. So it has huge implications kind of in their formal life, but also in their informal life as well, with their identification of just being from that particular group. And it also might have impact on communities' ability to develop self-protection mechanisms if it involves kind of negotiating or speaking to members of an armed group who have been designated as a terrorist group as well. Again, it can just have severe complications for them. That's not to say that it's all doom and gloom. Progress is being made at the international level. Particularly, we have the exemption 2664, which provides humanitarian exemptions. And at the domestic level, we work very hard to ensure that there are humanitarian carve-outs in any CT legislation. The Philippines is a great example of this. In 2020, the Section 13 humanitarian exemption was implemented in the Anti-Terrorism Act, which provide exemptions for material support to designated terrorist groups. We also have similar humanitarian carve-outs in Chad and Ethiopia and other places. And these are really kind of essential for us to be able to, for us and for other humanitarian organizations to be able to conduct their work.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something that has happened in Canada as well. So if we want to help projects abroad, it has been an issue. So now we have a humanitarian carve-out as well if we want to be able to help out the communities. So it has been a really contemporary and universal issues in terms of sanctions. I'd like to come back maybe to the trust part of it, because the report talks a lot about the community trust. And I wanted to know, because it is an issue, and we read a lot of people talking about the fact that trust can really be hard to get. So how can the ICRC and other humanitarian actors, of course, you can maybe talk more about the ICRC perspective, but how can you strengthen this trust and the perception as well of neutrality? So not only being neutral, but appearing neutral to the community. And is there a way to identify if that trust is improving or not?
Yeah, thank you. All very pertinent questions for myself, but also more importantly, my colleagues in the field. So I think there's two aspects of trust I'll talk about. One, you mentioned about ICRC, but also one that's really important in contested territories is the trust kind of between communities. So what we found is that often contestation and weaponization of identity kind of destroys many of the social bonds that people had prior to the conflict within the community, kind of a you're either with us or against us feeling. And these go on for years and years, long after the fighting has gone out. And similarly, between kind of communities and armed actors as well. Often as an external observer to some conflicts, you think it'll be easier to go to the persons who are from the community leaders and elders, but often many of these people have lost their legitimacy and their standing, and there's actually potential interlocutors who have kind of a different role in the community that actually are able to work and build trust between the community and the armed actors there as well. So that's just something from the humanitarian actors side. It requires staying true to the principles of neutrality and having a sustained presence and consistency to build trust with both communities and with the armed groups and with the state, to be honest. It's not just going a one-off distribution of aid and then leaving that doesn't work at all. It's really about having sustained presence and consistency. We have to engage with all sides, including armed groups, and be very transparent about that to everyone you meet and speak to. You have to explain what neutrality means, and so that engagement is a prerequisite of that with all groups. And trust comes from being seen to stand with that principle of neutrality for a sustained period of time, tested in different circumstances. That's really, really important. Again, the example of Cameroon is very important. I think we've been there for 6-7 years, and the level of access that is afforded to our teams now is completely different because of that hard work on kind of explaining what we do, why we do it, and being transparent about what we do it is. One important thing as well, both for the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations, is the importance of doing kind of social context analysis before you go into an area. Often what happens before an intervention is kind of do a quick snapshot of it in that time, and that might get fixed. But in contested areas, the kind of dynamics are just changing constantly. And so the importance of doing that work, of understanding the area where you're going into, who has legitimacy, intra-community tensions, discrimination, because poorly informed programming can be life-threatening for the community and also for yourself as a humanitarian actor. So doing that consistent updating of the area we're going to is super important. How do you know it's improving? This was a question kind of given to one of our very, very senior delegates who's 30 years in the field. So I'm going to take his answer for him from a different event because it's much more grounded than mine. First one is access is an indicator of whether you have trust. So often we go to areas and you can't get access because you're blocked, you're not trusted, but slowly you can get that. And often if you have trust with the community, they can put pressure on the armed group to give you access. We've seen that multiple times as well, where you go to an area of an armed group for whatever reason don't want to give you access, but the community want them to, and they can apply pressure for you as well if that trust is there. We also ask whether the quality of information is shared. So if people tell you about their concerns, people trust you with kind of very sensitive protection issues. If you're not trusted, then people don't share the information. That's vital for us to be able to do our work. So that's one way of also doing it. And also, of course, there's actual changes in armed group behavior, which is ultimately kind of what we're trying to do with protection as well. If we start seeing observations of international humanitarian law, if they start coming to us for kind of clarification or questioning or concerns, that's kind of from the armed group side, that's kind of the ultimate indicator that we're seeing that engagement on the lines of IHL is working.
Thank you so much. I think it's very valuable to have those kind of concrete indicators, especially when you work in the field of international law, IHL. So to have, how can we measure that? How can we know that the efforts is working and all? So I have a last question that I want to ask you, and then so I taking the time to tell people. So we are starting to receive questions, but I'll ask one more question. But if you have questions that you want to ask, please use the chat to ask your questions. And if I see already some questions that talk about some precise case, I might change it a bit, and we can explain why as well, why the ICRC will not necessarily speak of one particular situation, depending. But I think there are some good questions that we can also take some essence of. So my last question, and then I can open the floor, would be, does the report has recommendation both for donors and other humanitarian actors on how to improve that humanitarian response in contested territories?
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, probably won't be surprised from recommendations from the themes that I've been talking about. But the first one is to fulfill the obligations under international humanitarian law, both to states and to non-state armed groups. If you're qualified as being a non-international armed conflict, and it's unequivocal about the legal protections obligations you have to follow. So that is the first call from our side. From our side, there's also, to donors, it's about maintaining funding for contested territories are often tricky situations, often not at the forefront of the news as well. So perhaps not getting the funding as some other conflicts are doing as well. But being prepared to working in contested territories requires persistent presence and years of trust, which for many organizations is difficult to achieve because of the way that funding cycles operate. But to provide that funding and to maintain that consistency is very important. And then it's for humanitarian organizations, it's both to ensure that to not choose the area where it's potentially easiest to go, but those where protection needs are most, which is often in contested territories, and to do the protection-focused work alongside the assistance as well to ensure that these protection needs are being met. To do the social context analysis, which is important for working in contested territories, especially compared to other areas, to update it, to have that investment in time to ensure that kind of continuity there. And then a final recommendation is that we did see, as I mentioned, that there are kind of people living in contested territories show remarkable resilience, adaptation, and ability to develop self-protection mechanisms. And often we go in there with the idea as a humanitarian organization that it's kind of not to supplement it, but often the kind of the role of the community is not taken as seriously as it should be. And it's important to develop an understanding of the mechanisms that are being there and to support them rather than trying to supplant it. That's the final thing I would say on recommendations there.
Thank you so much. I think the recognition of protection of civilians have evolved a lot in the past few years. So we recognize that, that they are the ones living in that situation. And usually for a long time, they have been living in that way. So it's really sad and I guess impressive to see that self-protection mechanisms that are solid and are working, that people have come to create in order to protect themselves, I assume. So thank you so much for this. Now, I am now opening the floor to questions. So we have one question for now. It's talking about Sierra Leone, but Matthew, feel free to either talk. I think the question is really relevant on the ICRC's work in general. So the question is, have you ever tried to do research on the current government human rights violation towards civilians? If yes, does the Red Cross have any reports on that, on how they can intervene as well to help the civilians? And if not, whether human rights do try and reduce the people from the hands of the government. So maybe depending if you want to talk about this situation in particular, but also about the work of the ICRC. So what you are doing on the field to help out and protect civilians.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. So I won't go into the specifics of the case that was brought up. That is not a cop-out, but it's very fundamental to the way that the ICRC works. So I mentioned one of the principles before is neutrality, but the other one of the important ones is confidentiality. So we keep all our engagement with both with all parties to a conflict, so states or non-state armed groups. We keep our dialogue confidential. And that's because we feel that it's better to work in this manner, because it can actually lead to better outcomes for civilians living in situations of kind of armed conflict or other situations of violence as well. So we operate, I don't know in how many countries actually, and I think we have 63 delegations around the world. So we operate on behalf of civilians operating armed conflict, providing both assistance, but also we fulfill our obligations in Geneva Conventions for providing protection as well. And that means engaging with states on violations of international humanitarian law, visiting detainees to ensure that they're being detained in standards of international humanitarian law as well. So we have a wide range of activities there. We do not publish reports. We're not a human rights organization. We're a humanitarian organization, and kind of all our interventions are confidential, but always focused with kind of the people living in situations of armed conflict being paramount. And that's what all our work is for.
you so much. So we have another question. So it might take me a few more seconds because I'll be translating live, but it's about
It's
a very
okay, yeah. Oh, sorry. I understand it, but
okay. I'll ask it again just in case someone doesn't. But it's a really contemporary question on the impact of emerging new technologies. So we talk about them a lot, but in the conduct of humanitarian operations, what can be what they can bring out or impact the operations? Are there any ICRC publications about new technologies, especially in zones that are not accessible?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christian, for that question. It's a super important one. So new technologies, they're emerging rapidly, and they are changing the situation. From my side, I don't necessarily deal with kind of the potential positives of new technology and potential positives for delivering of aid or being able to access humanitarian areas, which I think there will be some as well. What we do find is that there are some ways that it can be useful to explain what situations of to kind of spread the messages on international humanitarian law. It provides new opportunities for doing that, and I've seen some interesting ways that works. In contested territories in particular, one of the biggest technologies that is impacting civilians and also impacting the ability of humanitarians to operate is the use of drones. Both military use of drones by armed groups and by states as well. So we've seen in the past 2 years the use of drones by armed groups massively escalate. Potential to go a lot further and a lot further range and with much more advanced weaponry than they have done in the past, which increases the danger both to the civilian community but also to colleagues from ICRC and other humanitarian organizations who are trying to deliver aid on the ground, and makes it far more dangerous as well. And so that's a really, really serious concern. In fact, the president of the ICRC at the Munich Security Conference yesterday was talking about the risk of drones and the proliferation of drones by both states and non-state armed groups as well, and the implications that this has for warfare. In general, I think I can also echo statements from ICRC leadership as well, is that the new technologies of warfare are developing rapidly, and we're seeing often a kind of lack of respect for life in the engagement of these new technologies. Some can be very highly lethal. We're seeing the development of autonomous weapons as well without kind of human consideration on them, which goes against international humanitarian law as well. And so it's very, very important to make sure that all technologies that are being employed in warfare do meet the IHL obligations that all parties to a conflict have.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, a topic which is rapidly changing, and we are trying to see all the considerations that can be mobilized by such topic. So we have another question, mostly on counterterrorism measures. So the question is citing the Ethiopian anti-terrorism proclamation, but I think there might be more than only one country in which it criminalizes the provision of professional assistance to armed groups designated as terrorist organizations. So how might this type of legislation and criminalization affect such an armed group's ability to comply with its obligation under IHL?
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, I won't speak about the specific case, but the question is very pertinent for a large number of cases. First one, criminalization as a terrorist organization. First one, it can impact the ability of an armed group to permit access to humanitarian organizations to provide assistance to civilians living in areas controlled by armed groups or by non-state armed groups. So that's an IHL obligation on a non-state armed group, and it can make it difficult for them to give access, which then doesn't allow us to be able to ensure that they're complying with IHL obligations in the way that they conduct warfare, in the way that detainees are being treated, etc. So that's probably the largest one. And then from our side of things, it also just restricts generally our ability to access, potentially restricting the aid that can be brought in. So it has, city legislation, it has restrictions and then also potentially on the funding as well of donors coming in as well. Again, it's also important to note that it's interesting with CT legislation because sometimes even if you have a humanitarian, sometimes even if you have a carve out or you have or there isn't, or it's kind of more even just a draft law or not even something that's fully legislated, it can still have the effect that is intended because it can potentially freeze humanitarian action, even though the actual legally it might not be watertight. It can still have that very much freezing effect, both on the donor side and then on the humanitarian organization side. We're trying to figure out what actually you can do with a new law. So often we see that it's not often fully implemented or ratified, but it can still have the effect because there's hesitancy on both the humanitarian organization side and the donor side as well. And then this obviously has big implications for ability to fulfill IHL obligations.
Thank you so much. We currently don't have any questions, so if you have one, you have a few minutes left in order to ask it. If I don't see you, I have more because I always have questions, but I'd rather give you the priorities, you being the audience. So maybe in the meantime, I can ask one. If we have another one, we can ask it later if time allows. So maybe just one question, and we talked a bit about it, but we talked about IHL and what would be the biggest obstacles to IHL compliance in this environment, if you have additional insights.
Yeah, the biggest obstacles they differ depending on the intensity of violence and hostilities. So often you can see if there's an active conflict, quite intense hostilities, can often have IHL violations around the kind of conduct of warfare being quite common. And it's difficult if you cannot get access to be able to kind of monitor that and to be able to see that and just try and hopefully change that. But we can still see in areas that people in parts of Iraq where we conducted research, for example, it's been 8 years since Islamic State have left, but there's a large degree of kind of stigmatization of people who come from communities that were occupied or that were taken over by Islamic State. And this can impact people's obligations under both IHL and also international human rights law as well. Ability to, especially around questions related to civil documentation and aspects such as this as well. But it's across all stages of contestation. There are different degrees of violations of potentially of IHL.
Yeah, we can assume that it is quite challenging, even with the best of fates, when you are affected by a direct, intense armed conflict to comply with the obligations. So, and then there's, I assume, a realm of degrees of knowledge of IHL and the willingness and being able to actually implement some measures. So it might
certainly it's hard to be able to disseminate and to go and speak to commanders or armed groups about their IHL obligations when it's difficult for you to get in. So that's actually something which potentially new technology is actually useful for, the ability to be able to disseminate messages even when you cannot get access to the area.
Very quickly evolving setting. So that's really interesting. So I don't see any more questions right now. Maybe I can open Matthew. I don't know if there is something that is burning for you that you really want to share with us as kind of the last question. Is there something, an information, and something you want to share with the audience before we end this?
No, I would just like to kind of, again, just re-emphasize the persons living in these areas experience. Often, so the motivation for the report came out that we do this kind of annual study, which comes out with these broad figures of 200 million persons living in the areas controlled in these contested territories. It's quite an abstract figure, but every one of those 204 million persons is living in these areas, which are highly difficult to operate in, very difficult to navigate, and they have to be remarkably be remarkably kind of resilient to survive there and to be able to thrive in these areas. So we really wanted to center people's experiences there and to show how humanitarian organizations can kind of support what people are doing in these areas already rather than coming supplemented. So I'd just like to leave you with that. We've spoken a lot about the legal situation here, which makes a lot of sense as well. ICRC as well is the basis of our work as well. But to really reiterate the kind of the experiences of people there, I would encourage you to read the report if you haven't already. I know it's potentially long, but in particular, I would encourage you to read the description of people's experiences and also how they navigate areas controlled and contested by armed groups as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Yeah, I think from here being in a webinar and talking about it, it can be hard to picture the sense of like civilians living their whole life in such a setting. So I think such a report that really centers the voices of people affected by such situations is really important. And I think a more recent way to kind of frame IHL obligations and to really look at the lived realities. So yeah, I see one last question. Maybe we can try to do it in like a rapid fire mode and to see. So how can we guarantee the protection of civilian populations in territories where violence is persisting? So I recognize it might be a quite hard question to just answer quite quickly, but that's the last question we'll answer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre, for your question. We can't guarantee it, but what we can try and do is we speak to states and we speak to non-armed groups to fulfill their IHL obligations, which they to abide by, so therefore they would protect the civilian population. It's not a guarantee, but we try our hardest to get them to abide by the IHL obligations. Yeah.
Thank you so much. A very pragmatic answer to the actual work on the ground. So on that note, thank you so much, Matthew, for your time. I know that in Geneva right now, it's almost 7 p.m. So thank you for staying with us during your evening and for sharing all of those really interesting insights with us. I encourage everyone to read the report. It is a worthwhile read, and I think it's worth it. Just a reminder again that we are organizing this webinar for the launch of the registration period for our IHL summer school. So the applications will open on March 1st, and the summer school is taking place from May 31st to June 5th. So if you have questions, I know on the information of the webinars, you might have the contact. So please don't hesitate to reach out and to ask your questions. So we'll be happy to help out. And I really hope we will see you there in Ottawa. Thank you so much for spending your lunch break with us. And this concludes our webinar. So have a great end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.